Hello everyone. As you know, there were many reasons why the Chinese came over to California during the mid-1800s. One was for the gold nugget. Another reason was to complete the gold spike. By that I mean to complete the western portion of the Intercontinental Railroad. A third reason why they came was for the gold fish. By that I mean they saw the untapped marine resources of California when they came over, and they saw gold in fishing for those resources. By the 1840s or 1850s, there were already fish camps established even before the gold rush took off. By the 1890s, there were fish camps all the way north from Vancouver, Canada to Baja California. And they were primarily fishing for just about anything they could catch. Abalone, shrimp, shark, many of the inshore fishes, clams, and so on. And most were exported to China. By 1893, at least 1/3 of all the commercial fishermen were Chinese. In Monterey Bay, the Chinese fishermen were there by the 1840s, and they helped Monterey become one of California's most successful fishing ports today. They were the first ones to find the commercial fishery for abalone, and also the first commercial fishery for the squid industry. There are three general areas along the Monterey coast that had Chinese camps. One at China Point, or sometimes called Point Alonis, and then in Carmel Bay, Stillwater Cove, and then a little further south at Point Lobos. Here's the Chinese fishing village at China Point, or sometimes called Point Alonis, in the late 1800s, which means that the village has already been in existence for 40, maybe 50 years when this particular shot was taken. As you can see, it's a fairly large camp, maybe consisting over 100 fishermen and families. And they were self-sufficient. They had their own general store. They had their shrine, as you can see, the Qigong temple. They even had their own gambling house and an opium den. By 1906, there was a suspicious fire that burned the village down. What caused the fire is unknown. When they wanted to rebuild, the city fathers said, "No, we want you out of here." Now, fortunately, the beach next door to Point Alonis was the Maccabee Beach. Maccabee Beach was a private beach, and therefore that person, or Mr. Maccabee, could rent or do whatever he wanted with the beach without the city fathers interfering. So he allowed the Chinese to move over to Maccabee Beach. This picture is a 1907 shot of Maccabee Beach where the Chinese were rebuilding their fishing village 1 year after the fire. As you can see, the Qigong temple, which didn't burn down, they were able to salvage and relocate it from China Point. By 1911, you can see it's totally built. You can see the Qigong Temple to the right. The building with the smokestack is what they call a reduction fishing factory, which were owned by the Chinese. And then if you look closer, you can see racks of squid. The interesting thing about this Maccabee Beach, or Mr. Maccabee, he had a morality clause in his contract with the Chinese. The morality clause included not selling liquor without a permit. Another part of the morality clause included that they could not sell opium to white people. The Chinese could smoke the opium themselves, but they couldn't allow selling opium to the white people. A third clause was that they were forbidden to have houses of prostitution on Maccabee Beach. Now, nearby this fishing village, just fairly above it, you can't see it on this particular picture, but there was the first Japanese fish colony that was established in the late 1890s. By 1902, there was a Japanese-American partnership cannery that opened the first cannery on what we know as Cannery Road today. Now we want to go over to Stillwater Cove now. Here we see Stillwater Cove, sometimes called the Pescadero Chinese Abalone Village. And there's oral history to indicate that the original Chinese settlers there came directly over from South China on these ocean-going junks. In fact, there might have been 6 junks that attempted to cross the ocean at this time. Apparently 3 did not make it. 1 made it up to Mendocino County, a second one here in Pescadero Cove, and a third one is believed to have shipwrecked at Point Lobos, just south of Pescadero Cove. The first documented Chinese were around 1868. So that means they were probably there in the early 1860s. Just south of Stillwater Cove is Point Lobos. And Point Lobos had many coves in and around the peninsula there. One of the large ones was Whalers Cove and China Cove. There were rumors that the Chinese were smuggling in undocumented Chinese from China directly, completely bypassing San Francisco and San Diego. Whalers Cove as you can see, is registered on the National Register of Historic Places today. And here's the cabin that have been preserved going back to 1851. And this is where they fished primarily for abalone. About 10 years later, the Portuguese whalers came in and shoved the Chinese out with the support of the local community. What the Portuguese whalers did was to use the cove to to haul the whales that they harpooned, and they would have big vats of boiling water, and they would cut the blubber and boil it down to make oil for lamps. But 10 years later, the kerosene lamp was invented and therefore put the Portuguese whalers out of business. The Chinese fishermen, however, never came back to Whalers Cove. But by the late 1890s, the Japanese came in here and built their first cannery in Whalers Cove. Just south of Stillwater Cove is Point Lobos. And Point Lobos had many coves in and around the peninsula there. One of the large ones was Whalers Cove and China Cove. There were rumors that the Chinese were smuggling in undocumented Chinese from China directly, completely bypassing San Francisco and San Diego. Whalers Cove the only competition that the Chinese abalone fishers had at that time was the sea otter. As you can see, has a great appetite for abalone. Back then, the sea otter was close to extinction due to the Russian fur traders. But even today, they are still on the endangered species list, protected by the federal government. The Chinese abalone fishers didn't have much competition until the 1880s and the 1890s, when the Italian and Portuguese fishermen came into Monterey Bay. By the late 1890s, even the Japanese came in to fish for abalone. And the Japanese were very skilled at deep diving. They could literally hold their breaths for maybe 4 to 5 minutes and go 20, 30, 40 feet and be able to pry the abalone off the rocks just holding their breath. They also had helmet diving as well, the hard hats. The Portuguese fishermen also had hard hat diving, so were able to get into the subtidal area below the tides and harvest the abalone, whereas the Chinese were limited to the inner tidal zone, and they can only pry the abalone off the rocks when the tides were low. The Chinese not only had to contend with the local community, their anti-Chinese attitude, the Portuguese and Italian fishermen were trying to push them out of the way. They also had to contend with the fishing game code. As you can see here, an excerpt that I've taken out of the Fishing Game Report of 1909 and 1910, it says, "The real purpose of the law was aimed at the aliens, Japanese and Chinese principally, where abalone was dried and shipped to China or Japan." So under the guise of conservation, they used the Fish and Game Code to push or attempt to push the Chinese and Japanese out of the abalone business. You can also see the second paragraph. It says, "The existing law prohibits the taking of the black and green abalone of any size at any time." And it was the black and green abalone that the Chinese were primarily fishing for. As the Chinese abalone fishers were being pushed out from the areas they normally fished, they were persistent, and they found another untapped marine resources that they could go after, and that was the market squid. They knew from back home that they could catch squid at night, and therefore they wouldn't be bothering any other fishermen who were primarily fishing during the daytime. They would have these metal baskets filled with pitchwood, and they would burn the pitchwood to simulate the moonlight, and the lights would attract the squid toward the surface. There would be 2 other sampans with nets in between them to surround the squid and therefore haul them up, and then they would dry them, package them, and export them to China. The irony here is that the Portuguese and Italian fishermen were familiar with squid fishing back in Europe. It was a delicacy back in Europe. But apparently here, the Americans didn't recognize squid as any important marine resource. When the Portuguese saw the Chinese were making money off of squid, they themselves started moving into the Chinese territory and start cutting the nets of the Chinese. Now, undaunted, the Chinese wanted to take them to court, but they realized under an 1854 Supreme Court ruling, a state Supreme Court, that the Chinese could not testify against white people. Nevertheless, what the Chinese did was find an American citizen who was willing to tell the truth under oath. So one night when the Chinese were out there fishing for squid, here came the Portuguese cutting their nets. The Americans saw everything, and the Chinese took the Portuguese fishers to court. Now, the American did testify under oath, telling them exactly what he saw. But the judge said the American citizen was biased and therefore threw the case out of court. Nevertheless, Even though the Chinese lost the battle, they won the war. And the reason why they won the war, because it created a lot of bad publicity for the Portuguese. And the Portuguese never again attempted to cut the fish nets of the Chinese. Even though the Chinese fishermen were eventually driven out of Monterey Bay, the way they caught squid back in the early 1900s is still being used today by squid fishers with more modern equipment. They still have a boat with very bright lights going out in the evening to track the squid. And they would have a larger vessel with a net guided by a skiff to surround the squid. And that's how they catch squid today. And today, squid fishing is one of California's largest commercial fisheries. In the 1890s and early 1900s, the railroad came in and brought in new settlers as well as tourists. They came primarily to be closer to the seashore and also to visit the beaches. And what they saw on the beaches were the Chinese fishing camps. And all they could do was complain about the smell of the drying squid and abalone. And this essentially spelled the death knell of the Chinese fishing in Monterey. They convinced the local communities to eventually drive them out. Now, the canneries at that time were also creating a lot of smell of drying and boiling fish. But nevertheless, the community kept them. In Southern California, the Chinese were primarily fishing off the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands were fairly remote and probably didn't have permanent Chinese camps there. They primarily came from Santa Barbara and San Diego. The fishermen would be dropped off on these islands for 3-month intervals. And there they would collect, dry, and package the abalone. And boats would come by maybe once a week, once every other week, to bring back the abalone to Santa Barbara and to San Diego, and then ship them up to San Francisco. And from there they would be exported to China. Now, like elsewhere in California, the decline of the Chinese fisheries began with the Exclusion Act, and by the early 1900s, there were even county ordinances that were passed that made it illegal to gather abalone from less than 20 feet of water. Here we are in San Francisco Bay, and in San Francisco Bay, the Chinese were fishing primarily bay shrimp, or what they call grass shrimp. You can see the various camps up and down San Francisco Bay, from San Pablo Bay all the way to South San Francisco Bay. There were camps even on the east side in Richmond as well. In Rincon Point, where the yellow arrow indicates, it was one of the larger shrimp camps. And in fact, it had its own mini Chinatown, separate from the larger one on DuPont Street. They had their own barber, they had their own teachers, and they even had their own herb doctors. You can see the picture of the bay shrimp. It's primarily translucent, and it would have dark spots up and down the body and on the tail. And they only measure up to a little over 2 inches. In North Bay, in Marin County, there was China Camp at Point San Pedro. And that was a fairly large camp. It was probably one of the largest and longest thriving fish camps in San Francisco. It lasted for about 100 years. Here's China Camp in 1899. You can see 3 piers sticking out, and anchored at 2 of the 3 piers are sampans. The white area that you see are the drying area for the bay shrimp. Here's a watercolor by Jake Lee called The Shrimp Camp. I think this painting was based at Hunters Point. And if you look closely enough, it actually tells the story of how shrimp are processed. You see Chinese sampan way out in the water there, and from there it's unloaded into big baskets. And the baskets are hauled on land, and you can see in the middle of the picture where a person is pushing a cart up into the where the shrimps would be boiled. The shrimps would be boiled for a certain amount of time, and then they would be put in these baskets again. You can see the baskets there. They're very red, the shrimp are, after the boiling. And then after they boil them, they take them out in the fields to dry. And when they're dried, they can either be shelled or left shelled. And they would put them back in the baskets, ready to be sold or shipped out. On the opposite side of Marin County is the Richmond camps. And there were, maybe a dozen or so fish camps between Point San Pedro all the way to near the San Rafael Bridge. Of course, the San Rafael Bridge didn't exist at that time. And you see my father's shrimp camp all the way down in Richmond Harbor. Why he was there as compared to all the other shrimp camps is somewhat of a mystery, and we won't have time to get into it at this point. Here on the Richmond side, opposite the Marin County, were quite a few shrimp camps, maybe a dozen or so, between Point San Pedro, Pablo, and what is now the Richmond San Rafael Bridge. Of course, the bridge didn't exist at that time. The earliest camps were around 1870, and most of them lasted around to 1912 and beyond. This is how the Chinese caught shrimp in San Francisco Bay back in the late 1800s through early 1900s. And they would lay these cone nets down on the bottom, and you can see the direction of the tides, and the tides would push the shrimps into the cone nets. The cone nets were pretty large, 4 feet at its mouth and 40 feet long. Here's a bird's eye view of how the nets are set. You can see the cone nets are set side by side, maybe a half a dozen or so. And they will be set during slack tide, meaning in between the turning of the tides. And the tides would wash the shrimp into the nets. They would be hauled up to the surface and into the boats. After the next tidal cycle, when the tides begin to change, they would have to hurry and turn the nets all the way around 180 degrees, because the tides would change and then it would push the shrimps back into the nets. However, setting these nets was outlawed in around 1910, 1911, but was partially repealed in 1915, at least in northern San Francisco Bay. In South San Francisco Bay, it was still prohibited to use these cone nets. Also, by 1905, exporting the shrimps to China was outlawed. but lifted again in 1919. But after 14 years of prohibition, I basically took the toll of eliminating, for the most part, shrimping in San Francisco Bay. But a few holdouts did occur, primarily at Hunters Point, China Camp, and a few over on the Richmond side. In 1914, Frank Spenger invented a new fish net for shrimping. It was a type of net that would not stay stationary on the bottom, but would be hauled by a boat very slowly in the water, and the bottom portion, or the cone portion, would be lifted off the bottom, and therefore sweep the shrimp into the net. Some of the Chinese fishers adopted this net in South San Francisco Bay, like those that were fishing off of Hunters Point. Also, some of the fishermen in China Camp, as well as over in Richmond, used this net, even though it was not prohibited to use the cone net up in North San Francisco Bay. My father, after a while, decided that it was cheaper to hire Frank Spenger to use this net to catch shrimp for him, and therefore he stopped fishing in the late 1930s. This was a newspaper article I found going back to 1934 in the Richmond Daily Independent, and it indicates that it can be dangerous in terms of boiling shrimp. Let me read this to you. A Chinese workman plunged to his death in a boiling cauldron filled with bay shrimps at a Chinese camp in Richmond. Lu Fu Chao, while attempting to empty a large basketful of shrimp into a steaming vat, slipped and fell into the hot, bubbling vessel. He died at the Richmond Cottage Hospital, despite desperate efforts by physicians to save his life. The third paragraph, the shrimp camp where Chow worked was at the foot of South 2nd Street. Now, when I read that, South 2nd Street, I realized that was my father's fish camp. Most of the shrimp from the Fong shrimp camp were not exported to China, but were sold locally primarily to Oakland Chinatown and to the restaurants. As my father was an herbalist, he extolled the benefits of the shrimp. And as you can see here, he mentions that it's good for clearing any type of poisonous pus from your body. And according to the Chinese Encyclopedia of Herbal Medicine, it was good for clearing up boils, tumors, pyorrhea, and it was also good for eliminating phlegm and other catarrhoid conditions of the throat. Now, whether this is tied into what the benefits of the shrimp that nutritional experts say today, I don't know. But today, the nutritionists say that shrimp is very low in calories, do not contain any carbs, has high amount of protein and healthy fats and vitamins and minerals. It does, however, contain some cholesterol, but is not known to really have much impact on blood cholesterol. Now, whether this ties in with the issues of eliminating poisonous pus, I don't know. Here are some young ladies back in the 1930s that worked at my father's fish store. And they were probably going to Lincoln School at the time, making about 10 cents a pound during the Great Depression. There's a young lady that I want to briefly mention. Her name is Geraldine Lum. And she had a reputation in Chinatown. Even people spoke about it behind her back. She had the fastest hands in the West, bar none. But it wasn't the reputation that you might think of. She was known to be the fastest shrimp peeler in Chinatown, bar none. I guess you had to be fast if you're going to make 10 cents a pound. World War II, with the military buildup of the bases around San Francisco, primarily in San Francisco, over in Alameda and Oakland, and Richmond, and also in Marin County. With these military installations, they basically pushed the last fish camps out of business. For example, at Hunters Point. Also, the military bases had restrictions in the water areas nearby. They had patrol boats going around the water to make sure that there weren't any potential intruders that tried to sabotage the bases. And it just so happens that these water zones, these restricted water zones, included many of the shrimp areas that the Chinese were fishing. So that spelled the final death blow of the shrimp camps in San Francisco Bay. As I mentioned, there were a few that still existed, like China Camp that didn't close until 1955. Some of the ones in Richmond didn't close until the early 1940s. But other than that, that was the end of the shrimp camps. This is a picture of the shrimp camp at Hunters Point, I believe, when the military decided under eminent domain to take over that particular area. And you can see a sign that says, "No shrimp today." In fact, there was no shrimp at all from that point on. Well, I'm sure you're getting hungry now. And before we close, now it's time for some questions and answers. Do you have any food for thought? Any comments? You might even have some seafood recipes that you might want to share with us. But before we start, I need to add a separate video on the questions and answers because I forgot to turn on the audio on my laptop. So we will see you in part 2 of questions and answers. Hello again. As I mentioned in part 1 of the Chinese fishermen of old, the questions were not recorded because I had my recorder on mute. Therefore, I'm going to repeat some of the questions that were asked and attempt to answer them in this part 2. A question that was asked was, why was Fong shrimp camp so far away from the other shrimp camps in Richmond? As you can see from this slide, the Fong shrimp camp back in the 30s was tucked way in the corner of the inner harbor of Richmond, whereas all the other fish camps were on the seashore on the Richmond side. As you can see the star in the upper left-hand corner. Now, it's quite possible that my father's partner, who was the actual person that was quite experienced with catching and selling shrimp, had or bought shrimp from this particular camp back in the 1920s. And so naturally his partner would continue to buy shrimp from there. But that still doesn't answer the question, why was this particular shrimp camp so far away from the rest? And I can only guess. Now, there were a lot of shrimp camps along the shoreline of Richmond, just north of what is now the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. And I believe there was a concentration of 20 or 30 shrimp camps up there. So it was pretty crowded. And the shrimp camp, the Fong shrimp camp, if it was established there in 1930s, probably felt that it was too crowded further north, because my father, and well as his partner, knew that in the past there were actually tong wars among the fishermen to fight over the fishing grounds and perhaps the strategic areas of where the fish camps should be. So here comes Fong Wan and Gar Lee. Gar Lee was my father's partner in the 20s or 30s, attempting to crowd further in to Richmond. So rather than start a fight or start a tong war, I believed he moved south below the bridge. Another difference between the shrimp camps further north and my father's shrimp camp was that his primary customers for the shrimp was local, meaning he sold it to the various markets in Oakland, Chinatown, and he also supplied various Chinese restaurants with fresh shrimp. Whereas the shrimp camps further north were primarily exporting the shrimp to China. And furthermore, the shrimps that were my father were catching was probably below the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, whereas the ones further north were catching them in San Pablo Bay. And that is my best guess of why my father's shrimp camp was so far away. A question that was asked was, were the bay shrimp only from San Francisco Bay? Well, the bay shrimp had many common names, like common shrimp, grass shrimp, the black-tailed shrimp, and the distribution of this particular species of shrimp, Crangron franscorum, ranged from Puget Sound all the way down to San Diego. But they were most abundantly found in San Francisco Bay. The Chinese shrimpers not only fish for this particular shrimp in San Francisco Bay, but also in Tamales Bay. As far as fishing for the shrimp in other parts of the area, it was quite possible. Another question was there any interaction between the Chinese American and Japanese American fishermen, socially or commercially? And as far as I could ascertain, there was little to no interaction between the two ethnic groups. I think primarily because of the different cultures and also different languages, of course. Also, the Chinese had their own distribution and supply chain. They harvested the abalone and the shrimp. They packaged them. They sent them primarily to San Francisco and then exported to China. Whereas the Japanese, they also had their own supply chain. The different types of fish that they caught, salmon, sardine, abalone, squid, were harvested, canned, and then eventually sent over to Japan primarily. But because the Japanese had partnerships with American citizens, some of their products were also sent across the United States and to Europe. So they had a entirely different supply chain. A related question, did the Chinese fishermen take their catch to the Japanese canneries? Well, if they did, it was probably a relatively small amount as far as I could tell. The next several questions that I got relates to the Chinese fishing in Southern California. One question was there a fishing village in Ventura County? As far as a Chinese fishing village, the only fishing villages or fishing camps were in Northern California. There were no fishing villages in Southern California, primarily because the Chinese were fishing off the Channel Islands. And the Channel Islands were fairly isolated, probably didn't have a whole lot of fresh water, and therefore these camps, or so-called camps anyway, were very temporary. And as I understand, the Chinese fishermen would spend maybe 3 months out of the year and then rotate with another group of Chinese for another 3 months, and then go back to either Santa Barbara Chinatown or San Diego Chinatown. I haven't read of anything that there was a Chinatown in Ventura County. Does Santa Barbara still have a Chinatown? I believe they do not have a Chinatown at this particular point in time. Historically, it was a very vibrant Chinatown, and that's where many of the Chinese fishermen were sent over to the Channel Islands to fish and bring their harvest back to Santa Barbara. Also, I want to mention that the Chinatown in San Diego was actually founded by Chinese fishermen, primarily Chinese abalone fishermen, because the Channel Islands were the place where many of the abalone were harvested. Did these fishermen come across with families, as the miners and railroad workers could not bring wives? I would say initially, certainly well before the Exclusion Act, for example in Monterey Bay, when the Chinese came over on ocean-going junks into Monterey, directly avoiding San Francisco and San Diego, they brought their families. Whereas if the fishermen or the Chinese came through San Diego or San Francisco, they would obviously have to go through the immigration station. And as all of you know, they were not allowed to bring their families, especially after the Exclusion Act. Another question: did the Chinese fish for sardines in the Monterey area? Initially, the Chinese did fish for sardine in Monterey, but they would fish for anything they can catch. But they didn't have the equipment to fish for sardine to make it commercially profitable. The Japanese did, and so also the Euro-Americans, and they were efficiently canned and then shipped and exported to other parts of the country or to foreign countries like Japan and Europe. At the end of the question and answer period, many of you came up to share your comments and stories, and I want to thank you for that. At least 2 of you were descendants of San Francisco Bay shrimpers of old and shared your interesting stories with me, and I certainly appreciated that as well. There was one story that I wanted to mention to you that was told to us at the end of the session. And this was a friend and also a member of BACGG. And she mentioned first that Geraldine Lum was her auntie. And as you might recall from the presentation, Geraldine was the fastest shrimp peeler in Chinatown. Well, she mentioned that her Auntie Geraldine mentioned to her mother and Geraldine were sisters, and this is what Geraldine said to her mom, that the individual bay shrimper that apparently fell in the boiling vat at my father's fishing camp in Richmond was not by accident, but it was intentional. And apparently there was some love triangle that was going on between the person who was shoved into the vat with and another shrimper and some woman involved. Now, whether that was just a rumor or a fact, of course, no one really knows, but I just wanted to share that with you. And once again, thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.